Hi, good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Shannon McGowan, and I'm the Programme Executive at Business in the Community in Northern Ireland. So we're just based at the Beam Centre, actually, down from Maydown beside you guys. So you can pop in any day when we're all back in business. But the program that we're running at the minute that's allowing us to, I suppose, have these webinars on this platform is called RETHINK. And RETHINK is an initiative that was created in April of last year. And its main aim is to really increase people's resilience and well-being as a whole. So we have Dr. Carlene Burrow, a clinical psychologist from Northern Meadow Therapy, with us this morning and on the 24th of March. For another session kind of on challenging negative thoughts and really coping and dealing with anxiety. So as I say this morning, we're going to talk a bit about anxiety, what it is, tips on how we can, I suppose, cope during this pandemic and with any challenging situation. So we only have the hour. I know that Caroline has a jam-packed schedule for us. If you have any questions, there is an option in the chat box where you can just write in, pop in any question, and I'll just keep an eye out. And you know, Caroline's quite free to talk about questions and answers throughout, but we also have a formal question and answer time at the end. So hopefully we'll get everything answered. But without further ado, I would love to introduce you then to Dr. Carlene Burrow.
Okay, thanks Shannon. Hi everybody, thanks for joining us today. So as Shannon said, we're going to talk a little bit today about coping with anxiety during the pandemic, and specifically we're going to talk about building emotional resilience and talk a little bit about how we regulate our emotions and how we can enhance our emotional regulation. As Shannon said, if you've got questions, just pop them in the chat box and I'll try and answer them as we go along. We've got an awful lot of material to cover today, so I apologise in advance if I go quite quickly, but you will have a recording available of the presentation, and also slides will be available and a couple of handouts afterwards that Shannon will get to you all. So we're going to talk a little bit about what anxiety is and how we experience it and why our anxiety might be affected by the pandemic. We're going to talk about emotional regulation systems, how we regulate our emotions in our body, and tips for managing anxiety and ways of increasing our emotional resilience, which helps us to cope with difficult situations. So what's anxiety? So anxiety is that general feeling of unease that we get. So we often talk about worry or fear. So that's all part of anxiety. It's just some kind of unease that something bad's going to happen, feeling uncomfortable. So this can range from being very mild and it can become very severe. Now, it's normal to feel anxious or worried or fearful in certain situations because this is part of our body's natural threat detection system, or our fight or flight response. So anxiety helps us to manage dangerous or risky situations. It kind of gives us a warning that there might be a threat there, so we can do something about it and keep ourselves safe. However, anxiety can become intrusive in our lives, and it can develop into anxiety disorders such as generalized anxiety disorder or panic disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, or obsessive compulsive disorder. So how do we experience anxiety? So all of us will have experienced anxiety at some point in our lives, whether it's because we've been in a dangerous situation or whether it's we've been giving a presentation at work, taking an exam. But we all experience anxiety. So when we are in the height of anxiety, we have racing thoughts. So our thoughts are very, very fast. We often overthink situations. We may also have difficulty concentrating or focusing on something when we're anxious. And we may have this heightened sense of alertness. So we're on high alert, you know, we're essentially scanning for danger. We may feel irritable or have feelings of dread or panic or that kind of sense of impending doom. Now, if we have anxiety over a period of time, we might find that we've got changes to our sleep patterns. Normally, we find it more difficult to sleep when we're anxious, and we might have changes to our appetite as well. Now, that could be eating less, it could also be overeating. When we feel anxious, we often want to escape from the situation that we're in. So this is the body's fight or flight response, where we get prepared to either fight danger or run away from it. And so our anxiety prepares us to flee from something. Now, this is great if we're facing a saber-toothed tiger and we might need to run away. But sometimes we get anxiety in situations that we can't run away from. So, for example, something in work, having a meeting in work that you don't want to go to. In extreme cases, we may also feel kind of dissociated. So we may feel like we're not connected to our own body, or that we're watching things that are happening around us without feeling it. So physical sensations of anxiety, again, we probably all recognize these as sweating, feeling hot, our breathing becomes fast and often heavy, our heartbeat races, we may have hot flushes or blushing. Often we have a dry mouth. Just talking about having a dry mouth, I get a dry mouth. And again, we might find that we shake when we're very anxious. And again, with long-term anxiety, we might actually experience some hair loss, extreme tiredness or lack of energy if we're undergoing long-term anxiety, or straight after we've experienced severe anxiety. We may also experience headaches, stomach aches, dizziness or fainting, or nausea and vomiting. So all of these are symptoms of anxiety. So let's put anxiety into the context of how we regulate emotional responses. So we have three major emotional regulation systems which help us to survive in the world. And each of these systems comes online one at a time. And when one's online, the other one can't be online. And each system has a different important job to do. So when a system's activated in our brains and bodies, we experience certain emotions and engage in certain behaviours. So we have the threat or self-protection system, we have the drive or resource-seeking system, and we have the soothing or affiliative system. We're going to talk about each of these in a little bit more detail. So the threat system, so the job of this system, so this is the system held within our brains and our bodies, is to identify and respond to threats, to seek safety and to self-protect. So obviously we need this system to be able to survive in the world. And the emotions that help us respond to threats or help warn us of threats are anger, anxiety and disgust. So in these primary forms, these emotions give us messages around unjust or boundaries being crossed. So that's with anger. Anxiety is all about, as we said, some kind of threat to us in some way, an internal threat to how we feel about ourselves, or an external threat of danger. And disgust in its primary form is an emotion that keeps us safe from things that might be bad for us. So, for example, when we smell rotten milk, we have a feeling of disgust, and that tells us not to drink it. So the behaviours associated with the threat system are that fight or flight response, which also includes a freeze response. So this is our body's natural way of coping with threat, where we're prepared to either fight, so we might feel that our muscles are tensing up, that our heart rate's increasing, that we're ready to fight, but we're also ready to flee, to flight. So we're prepared to run away from the thing that's a threat. One of the other behaviours that's involved with the threat system is like a shutdown behaviour, and this is the freeze response. So this is why sometimes when we experience extreme anxiety, we might not be able to do anything. We might feel paralysed or overwhelmed in some way. And the brain chemistry that works in this system is adrenaline. So we've all experienced that hit of adrenaline when we have been faced with some kind of threat. And cortisol, which is the stress hormone, which is what we experience when we're under stress. Now, the motto of this system is it's better to be safe than sorry. So the threat system in the body comes online really quickly. So if I hear a noise behind me now, I'm going to jump, my body's going to tense up, my heart's going to start beating faster. I'm going to orientate myself to what I think might be a threat. So I do this in in a nanosecond before I even have time to think. And my body's already prepared to fight what it is or to run away. Now, what I turn and I see it's just my cat has knocked something over. It's not a burglar. It's not someone coming to get me. So then I can relax again. But that threat system is being activated like that because we need it to keep us safe. So the next system that we have is the drive system. And the drive system's job is to motivate us, to move us to resources for survival. So obviously we need this system so that we can seek shelter, food, sexual opportunities. And in the modern world, this is about seeking money, status, and success as well. So the emotions that are associated with this system are excitement, joy, desire, sense of achievement. And what we engage in our behaviours is seeking or achieving, focus and attention, goal setting behaviours, and consuming. So this is all about getting things done. And the brain chemistry involved with this is the chemical dopamine, which makes us feel good when we've achieved something. And the final system that we have is the soothing or affiliative system. So this system of emotional regulation is there to help us to rest, to manage distress, to give and receive care, and to bond with others. So the emotions associated with this are the sense of contentment or calmness, safety, trust, connection. And the behaviours associated are caregiving and receiving, nurturing, support and encouragement. So the brain chemistry involved in this system is the chemistry of oxytocin and the body's natural opiates. So these are the chemicals that make us feel good. So oxytocin is released when we breastfeed, when we make love, when we pet an animal, and it's that kind of warm and fuzzy feeling that we get. So this system is there so we can rest, we can digest, we can connect with others. So as you can see, we need all of these different systems in order to be able to function and regulate our emotions. And these have been developed since we first appeared on the earth as human beings. And as I said, when one of the systems is activated, the others aren't. Now, what's this got to do with the global pandemic? Well, the situation with a global pandemic is actually affecting all of our systems at the moment. So it may be that we can't activate our drive systems and our soothing affiliative systems as well as we used to do because of changes to daily life. So we might find that we're finding it harder to regulate our emotions with these systems, and so we're spending more time in the threat system because that's more activated. Because we are living in a state of some threat to a certain extent, our threat system is constantly being activated. So we're being activated when we hear the news, when we hear death counts, when we're being given new rules to follow, that all might activate our threat system. And sometimes it's difficult to know the actual reality of the threats associated with this situation because we can't quite work out, what's the reality of the virus in terms of our personal threat or our threat to people around us, because we don't know everything we need to know about it, because information is sometimes changing. So, excuse me, I'm very sorry about this, but I am just going to turn off my phone, which has started beeping. Apologies about that. So we don't know what the actual reality of the threats are sometimes. So as we said, because the threat system works on the basis of better to be safe than sorry, we might be often being activated into the threat system. And also we can activate the threat system just by worrying about threats. So by thinking about threats, we can activate that system. So why does the global pandemic increase our anxiety? So as we said, our threat system is being activated more than usual, and fear and anxiety is part of that system. Our drive system or soothing affiliative systems may not be working as well. So we might not be able to connect with others as much as we used to do and activate our soothing affiliative systems. We might not be able to rest as well as we used to do, because maybe the activities we used to do to rest have been taken away from us, or actually it's just really difficult to get 5 minutes alone because everybody's at home. Our drive system may not be working as well because we can't activate it in some of the activities we used to do. So our work might have changed, our activities such as competitive sport might have changed. So we might be finding it's more difficult to get out of that threat mode. As we said, there is a real threat that's happening at the moment. So that's going to activate our anxiety, but also we might worry about other things. So we might be worried about how we think we should be coping. So we might feel that we should be coping absolutely fine, and then we become anxious about how we are actually coping. We may be worried for the future, so that might be about what is new normal going to look like. We might be worried about job security or financial security for ourselves or our loved ones. And it's likely that with all these changes to our life that there's been some impact on our relationships. So it may be that we're seeing a lot more of some people in our lives, and that could put a strain on our relationships. Or it may be that we're seeing a lot less of other people in our lives, and again, that can make us feel less supported or put a strain on those relationships. Again, affecting our anxiety. And we may be worrying about the well-being of others. So particularly if we can't see people as often as we would like to. We may also develop existential worries. So we may have changed the way that we see the world and we interact with the world because of this huge global event. And it may have made us question what's really important in our lives, which can bring up this sense of existential anxiety. What's the meaning of life? What we're all doing here? And of course, there's lots of other issues associated with the pandemic that affects our well-being and potentially our anxiety. So having to be in lockdown or having to self-isolate or shield, changes to routine, family stress, isolation, bereavements, etc. And in amongst all of this, we have to cope with normal life stresses. So we have to cope with how do we manage work, how do we manage family care commitments, etc., etc., etc. And if we are somebody who already suffers from a mental health problem, such as anxiety, depression, or PTSD, we might find that the global pandemic is making that worse. So we can see why anxiety is likely to be increased during this time. So how are we going to manage it? What can we do about that? So the first thing is to accept the normal emotional responses to the pandemic, that actually we are going to all be feeling a bit all over the place at the moment. And we'll talk about some of those normal responses in a minute. Recognize when you're feeling anxious and what triggers it. So what's triggering off your threat system? Take action if you need to. So often we avoid action when we're anxious. Learning to cope with uncertainty is helpful. Managing anxious thoughts, and our webinar on the 24th of March is going to be focusing just on how we manage unhelpful thought patterns. So if you know that you struggle with anxious thoughts, that's the one to watch. Managing health anxiety, so we'll talk a little bit more about what health anxiety is at the minute. And what we can also do is activate our drive or self-soothing affiliative systems to bring us out of threat and also increase our emotional resilience. So I'm not going to read out all of these because you do have the slides available to you afterwards, and I'm conscious of the time. But there are many normal emotional responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. So we've talked about anxiety and the reasons why we might feel anxious. We also might feel confused and conflicted because of differences in information, changes in our lives. We might feel irritability or anger or frustration. So that might be about, again, changes in our life that's made our life more difficult. It might be directed at other people who don't follow the rules. It might be that you don't agree with the rules and you become angry and frustrated with them. And it might be about the unfairness of the situation, that actually the pandemic affects people differently. We might be experiencing grief, so that could be from personal bereavements or from the global loss of life, and also because we've had huge changes to our lifestyle, which can trigger a grief reaction as well. We might feel guilt that we're not really affected by any of this, that actually we're doing okay. Or we might just feel nothing. We might be feeling completely numb about the whole thing, or be developing what we call compassion fatigue, where we just kind of burn out, don't feel anything. We might be feeling trapped or controlled or powerless. So these are all normal emotional responses given what's going on. So notice when you're in threat system and minimize any current threats, any real threats out there. So we can do this by following all the guidelines of hand washing, social distancing, self-isolation if needed. And in terms of other threats in your life, you might need to get more information about things like financial support or mental health resources. But also notice which threats might be over-exaggerated by our own thinking. So, or by spending too much time watching the news or social media, and reduce our behaviours associated with this. So have breaks from social media or from the news. You know, have some time without thinking about COVID if you know that that's causing you to get into threat system. And build up tolerance to things that cause you anxiety slowly. So we'll talk in a minute about how often we try and avoid things that cause us anxiety. Ask for help and make a plan. And the good old adage of control what can be controlled and let go of the rest. So we can only control certain things in our lives, and often we become anxious because we're trying to control everything that we can't. So let go of what you can't control. So notice and reduce unhelpful behaviours such as avoiding sensible action or information, or pretending that whatever it is making you anxious isn't happening. Being aggressive or intolerant to others, or excessive checking for symptoms. We'll talk about that in a minute. Also things like panic buying or using food, alcohol, drugs, or spending amounts of money to attempt to avoid distress. Just notice that you're in threat system there and try and use one of the other systems to get yourself out of that. So take action when you need to. So when we're anxious about things, we often avoid them. We often stick our head in the sand like the ostrich there. So for example, I'm worried I won't be able to pay the mortgage this month, so I'm just not going to think about it. I'm going to avoid looking at my finances. So remember that anxiety is helpful in warning us when we need to take action. So just some tips of commit to when you'll tackle the issue rather than putting it away. Write it down in a diary or program it into your phone that you're going to actually deal with this today. Get more information about what the actual threat is if you need it, and resource yourself. So what do I need to tackle this? So if you're worried about the mortgage payments, you know, who do I need to speak to work out whether I can have a mortgage holiday, or how can I maybe borrow some money in another way? Make a plan, use problem solving to do that, and also remembering to ask for help if you need to. In terms of coping with uncertainty, we're living in a huge time of uncertainty at the moment, and that is something that often makes us feel anxious. So, you know, people talk about dealing with very difficult situations, but if they have some certainty that they know when that situation is going to end, they can deal with it much better. We get very anxious when we don't know what's happening, when things are constantly changing. So reminding ourselves that this is where we are at the moment. We are coping with uncertainty, but that managing risk is part of our reality. And actually we manage risk every day. You know, when we get up and get out of bed in the morning, we've already managed risk. When we cross the road, we manage risk. So as human beings, we're really good at managing risk, and we forget how much uncertainty we do actually cope with every day. Develop self-compassion and be kind to yourself. So most people find it difficult to cope with uncertainty. You don't need to beat yourself up about that. Just focus on what you need to get through today or this week. So we don't know what's going to happen next week or the week after, but what do you need to get through today? And if that feels too much even, what do you need just to get through this hour? Focus on how you've coped over the last year and what you've achieved. So we've been living in this for over a year now. So you will have developed some good coping strategies. Think about how you've coped, how you've resourced yourself. And focus on your present. So things like mindfulness meditation is really helpful to help us to do this. So you can only do your best with what you have today. So just focusing on the present. Often when we're anxious, we fly into the future. We're dealing a lot with what ifs. So just beginning to focus on the present is a really helpful way of managing it. And we'll talk more about that in the next webinar on the 24th. Be grateful for the good things in your life. So practicing gratitude can be really helpful. And also trying to look after yourself, take opportunities to reset and relax. Talk to people that you trust about how you're feeling. So hopefully we've all got somebody that we can talk to about how we're feeling. And if not, there are organisations, and there's a whole load of resources at the end of this slideshow about who you can contact if you're struggling and you want to talk to somebody. So we're just going to talk a little bit about health anxiety. So this is a preoccupation with having or acquiring a serious illness. So it's the worry that either I'm ill with something serious or I'm going to catch something. And this is despite receiving negative results or reassurance from medical professionals that you're fine. So sometimes people call this hypochondria, and it's an excessive anxiety compared to the actual likelihood of becoming ill. So the likelihood is very small, but you have this excessive preoccupation with becoming ill or being ill. So often you'll be repeatedly checking for signs of illness or seeking reassurance from healthcare professionals, or also researching the illness. So often on the internet, researching symptoms. This can also present as being worried about other people becoming ill. And we often feel anxious, nervous, frightened. We might feel tired or fatigued or unwell when we have health anxiety. And we might also experience some body symptoms and sensations associated with whatever we think we're worried about. So we might, for example, be worried about aches and pains, or we might be worried about bumps that we have on our skin. Now, health anxiety is more likely to develop at the time of a pandemic, and research has shown from previous pandemics that this is what happens, that health anxiety kind of goes up because often our fear of illness is intensified by news and social media. We also become more aware of body symptoms, so we're being asked to check ourselves for symptoms, aren't we? We're being asked to look out for a cough, we're being asked to look out for temperatures and things like that. And we're also more aware of hygiene and infection control. So that idea of illness being present in our lives has become a little bit closer to us. So this is why we tend to develop health anxieties in times such as pandemics. Now, from past pandemics, research has shown that generally it usually resolves. So once somebody develops health anxiety in a pandemic, once that pandemic has kind of passed, once things have got a little bit more back to normal, then once the threat's gone, that health anxiety resolves. But if you are finding that you're more anxious about your health at the moment, there's some tips here of how to manage that. So again, as we said, minimize the real threat. So do what you can to look after yourself. If you are somebody who's more at risk, have a plan for yourself and other people who might be more at risk as well. Limit or avoid unhelpful media. So only use reliable sources of information. So for example, if you have a pre-existing condition, talk to the doctors and nurses who deal with that about what information you might need, or seek good sources of information, not just Googling everything or using social media as a source of information. Cut down or stop the behaviours that fuel your health anxiety. So one of the things that we often do is check for symptoms or seek reassurance or search on Google, Dr. Google, for all the information. So keep a diary of how often you're doing that and gradually try and reduce these over a week. And what you can also do is challenge your thoughts. So there's some tips there about challenging your thoughts, but the webinar on the 24th will go into much more detail about how we can manage unhelpful thoughts. Keep busy with other things, so distract yourself, go call a friend instead of getting on Dr. Google, and try and get back to normal activities. So often if we're avoiding activities because of health worries, try and get back to those. Obviously, that will depend on what we're able to do and not do at the moment. And learning how to relax, so things like meditation, yoga, breathing exercises are all really helpful in managing this. So, other ways of managing our anxiety then. So to get us out of threat system, how do we activate the drive system? So there's some tips there of how to activate the drive system. So setting yourself an achievable goal, teaching or sharing knowledge, writing down good things that have happened, staying physically active, celebrate achievements. All of these things activate the drive system and help us move out of threat systems, so help reduce our anxiety. They're all things that you can try and put into your daily routine. And we can also reduce our anxiety, come out of threat system by activating the soothing or affiliative system. So connecting regularly with others in whatever way we can at the moment. If you're not a people person or there aren't people around, spending time with an animal, with a pet, cuddling a loved one if you're able to, or giving yourself a hug or wrapping yourself up in a blanket actually activates this system and helps us to just come out of threat. So smiling. Now, the only thing I don't like about these webinars is I can't see you all, but I'm just going to ask you just to try and smile now. So you might just want to let your corners of your mouth raise just slightly into a slight smile, or you might feel like you can go into a big grin and just spending time smiling. So when we smile, there's lots of feedback loops going through our brain, and actually it helps to lower our heart rate. It helps us to feel better because it activates this soothing or affiliative system. So when we're really anxious, if we can just get into the habit of allowing ourselves to smile, that can actually lower our heart rate, our blood pressure, slows our breathing down. Listening to peaceful music, watching a feel-good film, meditation, again, yoga, tai chi, all of these things are really good to learn. Spending time in nature, again, lots and lots of research coming out that the more time we spend in nature, that actually it helps reduce our anxiety. It helps us to develop emotional resilience. It helps to activate this soothing or affiliative system. So there's lots of tips there. I guess that you're probably doing some of those already, but just reminding ourselves, particularly when we're anxious, to activate this system and get out of that threat system. So there is a soothing rhythm breathing exercise that unfortunately I'm not going to have time to do with you today, but I'll get a handout sent out to you and you can practice that at home, or you can access that via the internet and have a go at that. And this is a really good breathing exercise that just, again, helps us to activate that soothing system, helps to bring us out of threat system. So emotional resilience then. We're going to talk a little bit about emotional resilience. So we've talked about how we regulate emotions. So emotional resilience is made up of how we regulate emotions. So we need to be able to regulate emotions to be able to have emotional resilience. And emotional resilience is essentially the ability to adapt to stressful situations or crises, or the idea that we can bounce back after something difficult has happened, how we cope in the face of a major life stressor. So obviously we're all activating our emotional resilience at the moment. We're all finding ways to survive this global pandemic, which is a difficult situation. Now, we might find that some people naturally have a bit more emotional resilience than others. However, we can learn it and we can develop it. So even if you don't feel very emotionally resilient, you can learn and develop that skill. So it's a collection of behaviours, thoughts and actions. So when we think about emotional resilience, it comprises of many factors. So it comprises of kind of physical factors of our health and well-being, our levels of energy, our vitality. It also includes more psychological factors such as our self-awareness, self-esteem and confidence. As we said, our emotional awareness and regulation, but also things like persistence and self-motivation, flexible thinking and reasoning abilities. And it also includes our interpersonal relationships, so how we communicate, how we cooperate, how we work with others. All of these things make up emotional resilience. So all of these things help us to bounce back, help us to cope with difficult situations. So as you can imagine, to talk about all of this in an hour is quite a lot. So this is just going to be, as I said, a whistle-stop tour. So how can we get more emotional resilience? How can we develop these skills? So primarily looking after our well-being, that's the baseline. Looking after our health and our well-being is really important to be able to develop emotional resilience. Developing self-awareness, self-care and compassion. Enhancing our persistence or our internal motivation. Finding healthy ways of managing our emotions. So like we talked about, learning about how we regulate emotions and how we can adjust those systems. Developing flexible thinking. And again, we'll talk a lot more about that in the next webinar. Also improving our interpersonal relationships and learning stress management techniques. These are all really good ways to enhance our emotional resilience. So looking after our well-being, there's a slide there with all the normal things that we see when we talk about well-being. You're probably doing a lot of them already, or maybe not. But just have a check-in with that slide later in your own time and just check that you're getting your baseline level of looking after yourself is there. Be aware of staying up too late. Actually in the pandemic, a lot of people's sleep patterns have gone all over the place. Our routines have changed. So just have a look at that. Check in whether you're drinking too much caffeine or alcohol or eating junk food as a way of coping. Just try and reduce these things. So there's some tips there for a better sleep during the pandemic. And again, you can look at this at your own leisure. So self-awareness, how do we increase self-awareness? So learning to recognize our own emotions, just checking in, how do I feel right now? Naming emotions, what is it I'm feeling? Trying to understand our own internal conflicts. So we often are conflicted inside. So learning more about ourselves and what we struggle with and how our past might affect us now gives us more self-awareness. And committing to learning different ways of being or coping to improve your well-being. So if you know that you're somebody who overeats, for example, when you're struggling, commit to learning a different way, resource yourself in finding different ways, explore that, get help if you need it. Recognize and listen to your own innate wisdom. Often we kind of ignore this. So things like gut feelings, we often kind of talk ourselves out of it. But we have our own innate wisdom, and part of self-awareness is recognizing and listening to that. And also recognizing the links between your thoughts, emotions, behaviors, and consequences. So what drives your behaviors? What do you do when you're struggling? How do your thoughts interact with that? And again, the webinar on the 24th will talk a lot more about how thoughts influence how we feel and what we do. So self-care and self-compassion, again, really important in developing emotional resilience and managing anxiety. So make self-care a priority. Schedule it into your day, whatever that might look like. Making sure that you're eating regularly, you're resting regularly, that you're exercising, but also that you have some downtime, you have some time away from screens. Being kind to yourself, so self-compassion. Don't expect too much from yourself in difficult times. Check in on your expectations. Are you being fair to yourself? Don't beat yourself up for struggling. It's okay to have bad days. So treat yourself as if you would treat a good friend. So, would you be saying the things that you say to yourself to a good friend? What we know about self-compassion is that actually when it comes to difficult times and coping with difficult times, it's much better to cope with self-compassion than self-criticism. So we enhance our coping and reduce our distress if we use self-compassion rather than self-criticism in difficult times. So it's also about exploring your passions, spending time doing what you love to do. Often these are the things that get pushed to the back of our lives because we're too busy with other things. So all of these are really important in developing emotional resilience. So there's some tips there about practicing self-compassion. So noticing when we're in a difficult time, noticing what we're experiencing, the emotions that we feel, like anxiety. Reminding ourselves that we're not alone in this, that other people feel like this too. So often when we experience difficult emotions, particularly anxiety, we feel like we're the only person in the world who feels this. But reminding ourselves that we're common humans and that this is part of being a human to feel these emotions, that other people feel like this too. And if you have trusted others that you can talk to about how you're feeling, speak to them about how you're feeling. Treat yourself with kindness, talk to yourself as if you're speaking to a best friend, and write down or read positive statements. You know, they can be really helpful in dealing with difficult times, and particularly with anxiety. You know, just positive statements or song lyrics or a poem that helps to remind you that you're doing okay. So remembering that it's not a failure if you're struggling to stay motivated or to stay feeling okay. These are difficult times. It's okay to feel a bit all over the place sometimes. So the next thing to help us cope with difficult times, develop emotional resilience, is the concept of persistence. So this can be thought of as kind of an inner motivation, that consistency and commitment to keep trying. So I love this little diagram here because I think it really sums up life completely, that we have this plan, whatever it might be, whether it's about painting the kitchen wall, or whether it's about work, or whether it's about trying to get the kids to school, or building a shed, whatever your plan is. And it looks really simple, doesn't it? And then in reality, it's not. We have many setbacks, and you find out as you decide to paint the kitchen wall that the kitchen wall's falling down, or you're trying to get the kids up and ready for school and they will not get dressed, and one of them's under the bed and you can't get them out. You know, that this is the reality of the world that we live in. So reminding ourselves of that helps with the persistence, and actually we need to go up these ups and downs. We've done it before and we'll do it again. So recognizing the small achievements. So when you climb over that little wall, you know, celebrate the small wins. You've managed to get a child out from under the bed. Yes, that's a big, even if it didn't get to school, it got out from under the bed. So recognize those small wins, reward yourself. Don't be afraid to fail. You know, part of being human is that we fail. You know, some of the most successful people in the world are people who have failed again and again and again. So, you know, in terms of developing emotional resilience, in terms of managing anxiety, we're going to make mistakes. It's going to look messy sometimes. That's okay. That helps us to remind us to develop that persistence that's part of that emotional resilience. So also finding healthy ways to cope with your emotions, really important in developing emotional coping, emotional regulation. So again, this is things we've said before. We're going to accept that emotions are being part of being human. We're all being affected. We talked about all those different emotions we might feel during this difficult time. Mindfulness meditation can help us to tolerate our emotions. Spending time in nature helps us to manage our emotions. And there's lots of healthy ways of expressing emotions listed there. So finding ways, you know, to manage our emotions when we're struggling. And I always, when I talk about things like managing emotions or gratitude and all these lovely, nice things that we might be doing to feel good, what I always put in is a bit of a disclaimer about toxic positivity. So this is the idea that we might get stuck in this state where we think we need to be happy and optimistic all the time. And what happens when we engage in toxic positivity is we minimize the reality of a situation and we invalidate authentic human emotional experience. So we're not meant to feel happy and positive and optimistic all of the time. You don't need to be productive all of the time. And I think the pandemic has brought some of this to light that there's lots of great information out there about how to stay positive and happy and, you know, do all these great things in lockdown and, you know, learn how to bake and teach your children how to play the flute and build a palace in your back garden. You know, that's great, but you don't have to do that all the time. Sometimes you're going to feel rough. Sometimes you're not going to want to get out of bed. And it's normal, remember, for your threat system to be activated. So coping, stress management skills and emotional resilience is about being aware of all these other emotions as well and acknowledging that painful or difficult emotions and thoughts are part of life. So it's not about pushing them away and getting rid of them. So being compassionate again to yourself means that we're allowed to have a few bad days. If you find you're getting sucked into that kind of toxic positivity, oh, I must achieve, I must always be happy, you know, just check in what's driving that. Is it spending too much time on social media? Is it talking to certain people? And just limit that if that's unhelpful. So another way of developing emotional resilience is to develop flexible thinking. So I'm not going to talk much about this because, as I say, we've got a whole webinar on managing unhelpful thinking and developing flexible thinking on the 24th. But essentially, flexible thinking is rational thinking, optimism, acceptance, perspective. So we've got a balance there. So you have optimism and acceptance. So they go hand in hand. Adjustability and compassionate thinking. And really, when we're developing this style of thinking, we're noticing where our thinking trips us up. We're noticing where our thinking's unhelpful, and we're finding ways to manage that either through challenging the thoughts directly or just learning how to distance ourselves from unhelpful thoughts so we don't have to act on them or get overwhelmed by the emotions that they create. And as I said, we'll talk lots more about that in a couple of weeks. So as we said, part of emotional resilience is about interpersonal relationships. So in order for us to be developing emotional resilience, we need to have good interpersonal relationships. So focus on strengthening those relationships in your life that are nurturing. Now, all of us have helpful relationships in our lives and slightly more unhelpful relationships in our lives. So if you know that certain people don't nurture you or respect you, try and spend less time or energy with them if you can, and focus on those good relationships. So put more time and energy into those. Learn how to set boundaries in relationships. So we all need boundaries in relationships. We can't manage a good relationship without boundaries, and that will involve learning how to be assertive. So that doesn't mean always getting our own way. It means about balancing the needs of both or others in the relationship with ourselves. Communicate often and learn how to accept feedback and criticism. So for a good relationship to work, whether it's a work relationship, a partnership, relationship with your child, whoever, we need to be able to accept feedback and criticism from the other person. And that helps to develop our self-awareness as well, which you can find that often all these things from emotional resilience, all these factors feed into each other. So as we develop good interpersonal relationships, we develop better emotional regulation because we're activating the self-soothing system. We're also developing more self-awareness. So they all feed into each other. Ask for support and help when you need it. You know, we're traditionally not great at asking for support and help. You know, we often feel embarrassed or ashamed. And this might be kind of practical support. You know, can you help pick the shopping up for me? It might be for emotional support, but you know, often people like being asked for help, and they don't always want to offer it because they don't want to offend people. But ask if you need it. Similarly, offer it as well. You know, that if you see someone who's struggling, offer some help. And often the offer of specific help is more helpful. So can I pick the kids up for you, or can I do some shopping for you, or whatever that might be. If you're struggling with relationships, there's sources of help out there. So self-help books, there's loads of courses, podcasts, etc. online. Individual therapy or couples counselling or family therapy can also be helpful. But you know, we're social beings. It's important that we cultivate these interpersonal relationships to get through difficult times. So there's some tips there about connecting with others in the pandemic. You're probably all experts at this now. Obviously, when we can meet up with people face to face, yes, brilliant, do that. When we can't, try and find other ways of staying connected regularly. So whether that's virtually, good old-fashioned letters, if we've got time to write those, phone calls, etc. So developing stress management skills. I'm not going to read through this, but there's some tips there, and obviously there's loads and loads of resources out on the internet, books, etc., on how to develop stress management skills, but it's a key part of emotional resilience. Now, I'm just going to want to finish off just with 5 minutes here, just doing a little resilience plan. So it's putting all of this that we've talked about together. So I'd just like you to either just think about this in your head as I talk through the questions, or if you've got a piece of paper, just jot down the answers to the questions. So this is a way of just resourcing ourselves. So part of developing emotional resilience is learning from our mistakes, is reflecting on the past, is looking at what worked then and how can it work now. So right now, I'd just like you to recall a recent example when you were emotionally resilient, when you faced a difficult situation and you managed it, you coped with it. So just bring to mind that challenge or setback in your life. So it might be you experienced an injury, or maybe you'd had some negative feedback at work, or maybe you had a family argument. So just bring that to mind. So difficult situation that you faced well, that you got through, that you coped with. And then just think about what contributed to your emotional resilience. So we're going to go through the 4 S's, which are supportive people, strategies, sagacity, and if you've not heard of it, I'll tell you what that is in a minute, and solution-seeking behaviour. So first of all, just either think now or jot down on a piece of paper which people were supportive. Who did you turn to in that difficult situation? So was it a work colleague, a friend, a parent, a child? Who was supportive? And then just have a think about what strategies you use to face that difficult situation. So what strategies did you use to help with any negative thoughts or emotions that came up for you in that difficult situation? Did you go for a walk? Did you meditate? Did you talk to somebody? What strategies did you use to help you to cope? And then we come to sagacity. So this is wisdom. This is the wisdom and insight that we hold on to. So this might be wisdom and insight that we've carried down through our families. So my grandmother used to say this to me, and that helps us. It might be song lyrics that we hold on to that help us through difficult times. It might be poems or writing. It might be a faith or a religion. But what is the wisdom that you hold on to that helped you to get through that difficult time? Just have a think about or write down that. Was it a saying? Was it just something that you innately tell yourself, your own innate wisdom? Was it a favourite song that you put on whenever you're facing a difficult situation? And then just jot down any solution-seeking behaviour you did. So what did you do actively to help that problem? Did you seek more resources? Did you have a conversation with somebody? Did you address the issue? Did you resource yourself by learning something? Did you plan ahead? Did you ask for help? What were those solution-seeking behaviours that you did? So hopefully now you've got some ideas of what is your emotional resilience, what contributes to your emotional resilience. So some of the people that are part of your interpersonal relationships that contribute to your emotional resilience, some of the strategies that you use to manage your emotions, to cope with difficult times, some of the wisdom that you use to deal with difficult times, and some of the active solution-seeking behaviours that you use with difficult times. Now, we've not got time today to continue that, but what you can do is you can use this reflection to then make a resilience plan for any future difficult times. So what you would do is identify a difficult situation now and use those resources to apply them to the current situation, and then plan in what order you'd use them. So there's a handout on this that goes into it in a lot more detail. So what we'll do is we'll get Shannon to pass that on to you. But as we said, emotional resilience is about looking back on how we've coped before and bringing together all those different factors that contribute to our emotional resilience, and then using them in the future, using them in difficult times. So when we might need to ask for a little bit more help, so if anxiety or other emotions are significantly impacting on your life, so if you feel like you really can't manage the normal things that you manage in daily life because of these emotions that you're struggling with, or if you're losing interest in things you used to enjoy, changes in sleep, eating, weight or libido, or increased use of alcohol or drugs to try and help with mood. If you notice that you're reducing your kind of self-care, so personal appearance or personal responsibilities are kind of slipping, or you're feeling hopeless or thinking life's not worth living, or having active suicidal thoughts, all of these are triggers about when you really should be asking for a little bit more help. So to seek further help, speak to your GP. Medication can sometimes be helpful if your anxiety is overwhelming. Talking therapies can also be helpful, or you can find an independent counsellor, psychologist or psychotherapist. There's also a link there for a support group website which has support groups for pretty much everything you could imagine. And there's some more resources there on general mental health and wellbeing contacts. And then there's also our last slide is just some resources about coping with coronavirus, and also about building emotional resilience. So we've got a few minutes left if anybody's got any questions at all.
Carlene, thank you so much for that. I think the resilience plan was really good. It's actually quite shocking. I didn't realize there were some techniques and strategies that I do use. I'm not sure if they're helpful or not, which is another thing. But it's actually good just to be aware of it as well.
Yeah, and again, that's feeding into that self-awareness that you can actually have a look at, am I using unhelpful strategies? And if they are unhelpful, what other strategies can I kind of put in instead? So, you know, traditional ones are kind of reaching to the bottle, or, you know, avoidance, again, not particularly helpful strategies in the long term, but in the short term, they kind of make us feel okay. So yeah, it's building that self-awareness up.
Now, we do have a raised hand. Are you able to pop a question in, Paul, to the chat box or the question box? It's just, there's a wee orange drop-down box and it should say questions or chat. And I really like the part about toxic positivity as well. It's something that we don't speak about, and it should be spoke about more.
Yeah, definitely. Because I think it's great to have all these strategies, you know, and it's great to have an optimistic point of view. but we need to accept that, you know, we are living through difficult times, and even without a global pandemic, we all have difficult times, and it's okay not to be okay sometimes. You know, we don't have to be this wonderful version of ourselves 24/7. And actually that can cause a huge amount of anxiety, because we often compare ourselves to other people on social media, and why doesn't my life look like that, and why aren't I coping, and why haven't I built a 3-bedroom shed in my back garden during lockdown? You know, that actually we need to just accept that sometimes it's difficult to even just get out of bed in the morning. So that's okay. You know, we don't have to put these ridiculous expectations on ourselves all the time.
I'm not sure, Paul, if your hand was raised or if you were asking a question, because I was able to unmute you there. I'll do it again, but if you don't have a question, it looks like a high five, that wee hand, so maybe it was just that. Yeah, maybe it was just that.
Okay.
I also just thought, when you were discussing about the breathing techniques, is that something that will be in the next session, or the handouts will be really helpful? Because I do think
the handout has the self-soothing breathing technique on it. It won't be in the next session, the self-soothing technique, but we will have some other techniques in the next session that we'll have time to go through. Yeah. But the self-soothing rhythm breathing, I'll see if I can find a link to it on maybe on YouTube as well, that I can send to you, so that you can maybe see other people doing it as well as having the handout.
Perfect. Yeah, Paul was saying he doesn't have a question, just comment on how, just a thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Paul.
It does look like a high five, that wee hand. There's no other questions. If anyone does have anything that they want to comment on, just email me and I can forward it on to Caroline and we can get a response for you. So I'll send the recording and the slideshows and just those little breathing techniques out. So hopefully they'll be helpful. But thank you so much for attending, everybody, and thank you so much, Caroline, as usual. That was so, you know, knowledge to go home and think about.
Thank you, Shannon. It's been a pleasure to be here, and good luck to you all. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.